Good evening. It's a great honor and privilege to have all of you with us. Thank you for coming to this, the keynote presentation for the 17th Annual International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. When I say 17th, as we were speaking to President Bodnar, it still doesn't register that for 17 years in a row this conference is taking place, and it would not happen without the amazing support that you have shown us. So a round of applause for this wonderful Missoula community. All of you, residents of Montana, students, faculty, staff, administrators, you have all been very, very helpful and supportive, and we would not be here without you. As you know, the conference began this morning with great turnout for all the sessions. This afternoon, the Russian session had over some 120 attendees, which gives you a sense of what kind of interest there is in this community, and we hope that it will continue. Tonight, we have our very good friend and colleague, Will Todman, who comes directly from Washington, D.C., and I expect a wonderful presentation. We were with Will on the radio this morning, and it was a very easy 1 hour. It was the fastest 1 hour, enjoyable, informative, and educational. But before we do that, we have the honor and privilege of having with us President Seth Bodnar, the president of the University of Montana, who will say a few welcoming remarks. President Bodnar has been a great source of support and inspiration for all of us, and we truly appreciate him taking the time from a very busy schedule to be with us. So with no further ado, President Seth Bodnar of University of Montana.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kia. This is really exciting for me to be here. 17 years. And I am so grateful to this community, to Dr. Kia, to the entire team for having this event, for bringing this perspective here to Missoula, Montana. We talk about the importance in college and of the important role a university plays in opening eyes, understanding problems from different perspectives, understanding people who seem very different from us in more full and comprehensive ways. And that's really what this conference is about. We talk about Central and Southwest Asia. That is a region that stretches from Western China all the way to North Africa. And you think about the impact of that part of the world and the importance of cultural understanding and improved relationships between our country and that part of the world. It is so important. And this conference has furthered those relationships for now 17 years. And it impacts our students. We firmly believe in the importance of cultural understanding being an integral part of what it means to be an educated citizen. In fact, I might embarrass Dr. Kia just for a second that 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C., talking to some of our legislators, and then I went up to New York City to meet with several supporters of the university and alumni and donors. And I met with an amazing woman who was a former professional tennis player, a biochemist who had multiple inventions, a successful entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur, someone who had started multiple social ventures in different countries around the world. Just a Forrest Gump-like life she had led, and had supported our chemistry department. But halfway through our conversation, she said, "I'll never forget the course that I had with Professor Kia. Is he still around?" His course and what and the perspective that he shared has shaped me and how I've thought about so many things in my life. And so the impact to our students here, this perspective will shape you and impact you in ways you can't foresee right now. And I want to thank you for doing that, and thank all of you in this room who continue to do that for our students today, and importantly, for our community. You know, we talk about one of the key priorities for the University of Montana is to what we call partner with place. And what we mean by that is that the University of Montana is a better university because it's in Missoula, and Missoula is a better city because of the University of Montana. And this conference is a great example of that. So I want to thank you, the community members, for your support of this over the past 17 years, and I'm looking forward to 17 more. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Right now?
We will have a signing ceremony in a moment, but I want to take this 1 minute to express my gratitude, and as President Bodner just mentioned, this would not have been impossible without the teamwork. This is the result of the teamwork. I want to recognize, first and foremost, a very central figure in this program and in this center, Professor Aldi Kia. Aldi, if you could stand up and be recognized. The co-director of the Central Southwest Asian Studies Center, another very key individual, my dear friend and colleague, Professor Zhao Chen, who has been carrying the Chinese program, the language and culture program, on his amazing shoulder and for many years. And he's one of the most respected professors, like Professor Aldi Kia, on this campus. And also recognize the presence and the support of the Montana World Affairs Council, and especially the Executive Director, Janet Rose, and our very good colleague, Bob Seidenschwartz, whom I am proud to announce has joined the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center as a visiting scholar. Bob, please stand up and be recognized. Janet. As all of you know, the Shanghai International Studies University is one of the oldest partners of the University of Montana, and the Middle East Institute at SISU, Shanghai International Studies University, is a wonderful destination for many of our scholars. We have had a tremendously productive relationship with the Middle East Institute at SISU. Tonight they are here as a delegation. They will have a wonderful presentation tomorrow afternoon, but the time has come for us to renew our Memorandum of Understanding and Agreement of Collaboration. So I want to ask our Chinese colleague to join. President Bodner, please. Please. The shyness does not work here. You have to come. Please, all of you. Please recognize them and give them a Montana welcome. And President Bodner has graciously agreed to sign the agreement on behalf of the University of Montana. And my dear colleague, Professor June, who was also a visiting scholar at the Central Southwest Asian Studies Center, will sign on behalf of their center, the Middle East Institute. Please. Yes, both of them, please. One goes to China and one stays in Missoula. The other one as well. Yes, thank you very much. Now, I would like to ask Professor Zhao Chen to also say a few words about this collaboration, and then we will have one more welcoming remark. Please, Zhao.
Dr. Kia and myself went to Shanghai. That's about 9 years ago. And we happened to be in the president's office of SISU, and there came the director of a Middle East Institute. So we introduced each other, and I said, we have a great expert on Middle East issues. And he said, let's have a meeting tomorrow. That's how the relationship established. And Shanghai International Studies University is a national key university. It's ranked really highly. They have very many well-known, important alumni. They include our First Lady, 2 foreign ministers, probably 2 or 3 dozens of ambassadors, a lot of very important people. And right now, the Middle East Institute, Research Institute, is part of the think tank of the central government. So, and we have had relationship for 9 years, and they have 2 very important magazines. One of them is in English language. And 4 years ago, Mary Beth was appointed as a member of the editorial board. And that's a big honor, not only for himself, but also for the University of Montana.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Please take your seat. You can take your seat, and then we will give it you again, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I would like to now ask my colleague and friend Janet Rose, the Executive Director of the Montana World Affairs Council, to also say a few words of welcome, Janet.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is a tough act to follow, a tough act to precede. But I do want to, I know some of you are wonderful members and friends and supporters of the Montana World Affairs Council, and some of you are there are a lot of new students that may not be familiar with us. I want to tell you very briefly about it. The World Affairs Council was established in the year 2000 by Ambassador Mark Johnson, who is a Great Falls native. He had been ambassador to Senegal for several terms, and he was stationed throughout the Middle East. In fact, he was there during the hostage crisis, which if you're under 50, 60, you may not even remember, but it was one of the most critical times in world history. But and he did so because he felt that Montana has advantages and disadvantages. We're isolated in many ways, but we have universities, we have people from all over the world who are here, who are interested in what's going on in the world. So the World Affairs Council, very simply, our motto is bringing the world to Montana and Montana to the world. And we do that through, we're so honored to be a co-sponsor of a conference like this that is about as cutting-edge, contemporary, and on top of what's going on in the world as anything ever could be. So the Montana World Affairs Council really has kind of 2 branches. One is bringing world leaders, global experts to Montana, across the state, communities across the state. We're headquartered in Missoula, however. The other major aspect of what we do, and I do have a very exciting announcement to make, we do global education initiatives. So we work with students, K through 12, but primarily high school students, across the state of Montana. One of our signature events or education initiatives is called Academic World Quest. It is now the 3rd largest in the nation. This year we had a record number of students, about 300 students. We were going to have a lot more than 300 students, but the weather kept a lot of them away. So we had about 300 students who came from as far away as Browning, Miles City, one end of the state to the other. And they come here on campus. The University of Montana is a phenomenal partner with us, and they host many things, and they meet these students, and these students get exposed to a university setting. They meet lots of department heads. They learn about the options and the opportunities that exist for them in coming to a university. The University of Montana also offers scholarships to the winning team of those students who may want to attend the University of Montana. This year, as I say, we had 300 students from all across the state. We had about 6 reservation schools that had never participated before, that had never been outside of their communities. They had never been exposed to a university campus. And for 2 days, they met ambassadors, world leaders, global affairs experts. We had this year, because of our focus on Japan, we had a very large Japanese delegation, including the Consul General to Seattle. So the winning team for the second year in a row was 4 young women from Gardner, Montana. Last year, the second place team was from Sentinel. Last year, 3 of the 4 young women returned for this year, and they won. And so last year was the first time that any of them had ever been outside of Gardner, and they had an opportunity not only to come to campus, but they went to Washington, D.C. And for them, they said it was life-changing. Well, this year, because of the large Japanese delegation that was here, they said to us, you know, the Consul General to Seattle has an opportunity to enter students from Academic World Quest in a Japanese-wide competition to win an all-expenses-paid trip to Japan. Could we at least submit the students from Gardner, the team from Gardner, and the team from Sentinel? And we said, absolutely. So we all wrote all kinds of reports and all kinds of statistics about this. And about a week or 2 ago, it was announced that they were chosen. So we have 12 students and their advisors from Sentinel, and 11, I think it'll be a total of 11 students and advisors from Gardner who will be leaving in June for an all-expenses-paid trip throughout Japan, all because of Academic World Quest. Get teary. And these kids are being exposed to the world around them. I have to, you're going to meet our keynote momentarily. 300 kids got to meet Will Todman by video technology during Academic World Quest. And they were, I'm going to say, literally blown away by his talk on Qatar and on the Middle East. And so the impact that we can have through the Montana World Affairs Council is significant. And I see a lot of students here. I want you to know we have a very big internship program. It starts up it can be any time during the year. So if you're interested in international affairs, we really hope you'll contact us, and you can be exposed and learn a great deal. So we want to thank Dr. Kia. I love him. Everybody loves Dr. Kia. Even when he talked to the students, they were like, you could see their eyes were like, wow, this person is amazing. But anyway, the partnership that we have with the University of Montana is priceless. It's invaluable. And as a recruiting tool for these students, most of them are seniors or juniors, becoming seniors, thinking about graduation and what happens next. So it's a wonderful partnership. It's a wonderful partnership. I've talked too long. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much, Janet. And without any further ado, my very good and dear colleague and visiting scholar to Central Southwest Asian Studies, former president of the Montana World Affairs Council, Bob Seidenschwartz. Please.
I will make this brief because really we're here tonight to both recognize but also for our keynote speaker, Will Todman. It is customary to read a little bit of a bio and background, and I shall. Will Todman is an associate fellow in the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research focuses on conflict, displacement, and humanitarian issues in the Middle East with an emphasis on Syria. He has conducted field research in 6 countries across the Middle East and North Africa. And his analysis has been published in peer-reviewed journals by think tanks and humanitarian organizations. He has also commented and printed on live television to various outlets, including CBS, CNN, Foreign Policy, and the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He was co-editor of Independence Movements and Their Aftermath. He previously lived in Beirut, where he worked at the British Embassy and for the Office of U.S. Special Envoy to Syria. Will holds B.A. in Arabic and Modern Hebrew from Oxford University and an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. And before I introduce this very impressive young man, I got to raise the mic here just a little bit. This is easier. This is a very special moment for me. Will is a part of our family. He first came to Montana a couple of years ago and joined us for Thanksgiving, and it was blown away with Montana and the people. And to have him back, to be able to do what Janet described, and to have him here, it really occurred to me as I was listening to President Bodnar and his description of Mirdad Kia and the students in the university and the connection. This is building that bridge. To have a young man of this kind of background, this type of expertise, to be able to share this with you here is an indication that this is working. This is coming together to be able to bring people from different ages, from different perspectives and backgrounds to be able to do this. So without further ado, I'm honored and greatly just happy, as I could say, to welcome Will Todman here tonight. So Will. Let me put this back. I should add, too, that after Will's presentation, we will leave ample time for plenty of questions because I know you will have an awful lot to want to ask and to have conversation and dialogue. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Bob. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Dr. Kia. Thank you, everybody, so much for having me here. As Bob mentioned, this is my second time in Missoula. It is absolutely stunning, and I'm so happy to be back here. And it really is a privilege to speak with you this evening. As Bob mentioned, so I'm going to speak for a while, and then I'll open up to Q&A, and I will try as hard as I can to answer your questions, I promise. So I wanted to start by asking if any of you have seen The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. So it's a Coen Brothers movie that's on Netflix at the moment. And it's a collection of 6 vignettes which are set in frontier towns. There are saloons, cowboys, a wagon train driving across a prairie, exactly what you'd expect from a Western. There's also a lot of violence, as you would expect if you'd seen any of the other Coen Brothers movies. But what struck me, I think, was how alone I think most of the characters are. They're not just trying to survive, but they're trying to overcome a lawless, dangerous, and wild land. And they're trying to forge a new life, often completely on their own. Now, I'm not from the United States, as you can probably tell. One of the things that has sort of consistently confused and surprised me, I suppose, is why many Americans I've met are wary of big government and seem to want to get on with things on their own. Now, in the UK, where I'm from, people across the political spectrum will complain about the NHS, our National Health Service. But we're also deeply proud of it. And I think, in general, more state services are seen as a very good thing. So I've lived here for 5 years now, or lived in Washington, D.C. for 5 years now. And I've realized, I think, that part of the reason for these differences in outlooks could be linked to the origins of the United States. Bear with me for a minute here. So, as descendants of Europeans set out to tame the land, they pressed westward towards the Pacific. They hunted, they fished, they looked for gold, and they tamed the land. And as I understand, you grew up learning stories about these people, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, and Paul Bunyan. So perhaps then Americans value practicality and entrepreneurship, and a sense that you can make of your life what you want, and you don't have to rely on others to do it for you. So it doesn't matter that Americans aren't on the frontier anymore, even here in Montana, and that many Americans' lives look very different. I think these values probably live on. So the frontier, so stories of pioneers and Westerns, play a special role for Americans. And perhaps that's why there are still movies that are made about these topics, and why all the characters in movies like The Ballad of Buster Scruggs are really out there fending for their own. But you're not here to hear me slowly try and work out, or slowly try to understand American heritage and culture, I'm meant to be talking about the Middle East, so I will do that. I think it's fair to say that we in the West often think about the desert when we think about the Middle East. And some people may say, oh, that's Orientalist, that's an exoticization of the Arab world. But actually, I think the desert is really important in the minds of Arabs as well, and in somewhat of a parallel to the importance of the frontier for Americans. When Arabs think back to their cultural origins, they look to the desert as a place of simplicity, purity, and kinship. This might be surprising, given that very few Arabs actually live in the desert today, and even historically, fewer have than you might imagine. Some of the greatest cities in the world, Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, were in the Arab world, and even the Prophet Muhammad lived in a city. In Saudi Arabia, a place where I'm sure many of us think of the desert, when we hear of it, today 5 out of 6 people live in cities. This is Riyadh, the capital. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that most Arabs don't live in the desert today, just as I don't think it matters that the frontier is a reality in Americans' lives anymore. It's the cultural memory of the desert and Bedouin life, which is what matters. To survive in a desert, you have to rely on other people. You have to rely on them to provide you with food, provide you with water, perhaps rely on your kin to shelter you and fight for you. So while American culture might celebrate individuals who can make something for themselves, I think Arab culture is much more focused on ties of kinship and loyalty. So at CSIS, where I work, it's a think tank in Washington, D.C., we wanted to look at how these ties of kinship and loyalty might be shifting in the Middle East. The world is currently undergoing enormous transitions. I think when you think of globalization, mobilization, urbanization, the communications revolution, these things are having an enormous impact everywhere in the world. And we wanted to look more specifically at how they're affecting social ties in the Arab world. How are family structures changing? Who do people turn to when they're in need? Do tribes matter at all in the lives of young people today? And how are governments trying to reshape their relationships with their people? So to do this, we chose a range of countries across the Middle East. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Tunisia. And we chose these 4 countries to try and represent a range in terms of wealth, levels of urbanization, economic status, and tribal heritage as well. So my colleagues and I went to these 4 countries, and we conducted over 100 interviews with a whole range of people, basically asking them about how their relationships are changing, who they turn to when they're in need, and who they feel obliged to support as well. Our conclusion, and the argument I want to make tonight, is that these social changes, these huge global revolutions that we're seeing, are having a disproportionate impact on Arab societies, where rising individualism has posed challenges for family patriarchs, for tribal elders, and for government leaders as well. I'm going to start with the family. So, very broadly, if we think of Arab societies, traditional Arab societies, as a pyramid, then the family would be the unit, the base unit in most of them. So, very broadly in this sense, families are at the bottom, and then above them we have tribes, and above them the state. So families, each level, essentially accepts the presumed authority of those above them to mediate disputes between those that are below them. And traditionally, families play a huge role in Arab lives. In general, people would live with their families until they marry. Elderly relatives often live with families as well, and the whole concept of care homes for the elderly is still a taboo in lots of areas of the Arab world. And people are also expected to spend a lot of their free time with their families as well. Family visits typically occur at the weekend, and women are often expected to prepare food for these visits, and then the entire family would go along and spend a lot of time together. But increasingly, as we heard, young men told us that they're excused from these family obligations. so long as some people said, you're able to participate on the phone when you're needed. So even within the nuclear family as well, we've heard that people spend much less time together. I think young people around the world now have come to value privacy to a far greater degree than their parents did. One man from southern Jordan who I spoke to said he would describe the current generation, the young generation, as a virtual generation because they spend all their time on their phones, I suppose, talking to each other. And he complained that although friendships in many cases have taken on the role or the relationships that people used to have with their families, these relationships aren't as real in a way because if you were in need, you wouldn't be able to turn to your friends the same way that you would traditionally be able to turn to your family. There are gender differences in these obligations as well. I think women typically face far stricter obligations in the family setting to men. And increasingly, we had that women are expected to work outside of the home as well. So they're not only expected to care for their children and their husbands, but also to bring in an income as well. So basically, we found that families, the role of families is really shifting in a lot of, I guess there's a family, is really shifting in a lot of parts of the Middle East. And people's obligations to them are no longer as strong as they used to be. And so then we thought, what's causing these shifts? Why would this be changing in this way? I think a big part of it is economic pressure. So unemployment in parts of the Middle East is really dire today. In general, or in places like Tunisia, it approaches 15%, and for the youth population, youth unemployment is 25% in North Africa. In general, economies across the region are growing more slowly and living costs are rising at the same time. So this basically means that people have less resources to be able to spend on others. So whereas before you might have liked to have a big family meal and celebrate in quite a lavish way at the weekend, maybe now that is too much of an expense which you can no longer afford. Technology has had an impact as well. I mentioned before how some of the older generations were complaining that young people spend far too much of their time on their phones, which might not be unique to the Arab world. But in some ways, social media is also changing how people relate to their extended families. We had multiple situations across these 4 countries where people would say that now a WhatsApp group has replaced their obligations in terms of visiting their extended family. So now they have a group where all of the members of the family can chat to each other if you need to. They can send each other photos of what's going on. Someone in Tunisia said if one of her cousins has a baby, before she would have had to have gone and visited, and now she can just say congratulations on Facebook. So that is also having an impact, I think, so that people are spending a lot less time with their families. Increased mobility is another factor that's driving this, and I think that's also impacting intergenerational relationships. In northern Jordan, I spoke to some farmers who said that they had sold some of their land to be able to pay for their children to go to university in Amman, in the capital of Jordan. And what they said with sort of complete shock was they just assumed then that their sons and daughters would come back and visit them at the weekends as they had done. And they said now that they were expected to travel to see their children in Amman instead, and their children would say, oh, it's too expensive, it's too dangerous, it takes too much time, we don't have that much time. So even relationships, I think, between parents and their children are shifting. And finally, one other, I think, driving force in this is shifts in housing patterns. So in places like Saudi Arabia, the government often will provide housing for its people, and it will provide huge compounds where all members of extended families can live. And this meant that extended families could all live together, like right next to each other. And increasingly, the types of housing that are provided by governments are further apart. So they don't have as much land, perhaps, or they don't have the same resources to be able to provide these huge compounds. So that means people are living further apart. But I don't want to exaggerate this too much. I think in general, in comparison to American families, certainly, most Arab families still feel much stronger obligations to each other. But across our interviews, we heard that families are spending less time together, children are obeying their parents less than they did before, and also families in general are getting more liberal in the sense that they are more okay with their sons or daughters living far away. So, as families have grown less important in Arab lives, so have local communities. We heard of people living in apartment buildings who wouldn't know the names of their neighbors, even after having lived there for decades. Someone said to me that that in the past they would definitely have known if any of their neighbors were getting married, and now the only way they can tell is if they hear honking, because it's a tradition that after a wedding there'll be a whole chain of cars which are all honking. But I think more significantly than the local communities, tribes are also becoming a lot less important in young people's lives. Tribes have traditionally played a really important role in much of the Arab world, not in all of it, but in much of it. So as the first leaders, I think, sort of set out to try and consolidate their control over their areas, they really had to win the support of tribes to be able to extend their rule. And in exchange, tribes would then be given political influence, money, and other resources, which they could distribute to their members. Tribes are also, I think, or were, an important part of social life for a lot of people. The Majlis is a place where traditionally people would go on Fridays, at least, and would spend time socializing, exchanging stories, and also settling disputes. Now, in places like Jordan, I think tribes still do play an important role in elections, where tribal candidates will run to secure resources for their tribe, and I think the members feel an obligation to vote for members of their own tribe purely based on their shared identity. Now, having said that, I did speak to one man, probably in his 50s in Jordan, and I was talking to him about this, and I was talking about sort of, oh, do you always have to vote for your members of your tribe? And he looked really sheepish, and he said to me, well, actually my brother ran, but I couldn't bring myself to vote for him because I couldn't bring myself to vote for an idiot. So, tribal identity doesn't always trump everything, I suppose. But tribes do still confer benefits on their members, and I think their members still expect them to confer these benefits upon them. That can range from covering the costs of weddings. I heard examples in Saudi Arabia where people who were less well off would have their tribes would arrange a mass wedding, so there would be multiple couples getting married at the same time. They would have a huge celebration which was paid for by the tribe, which allows them to overcome how expensive weddings are in much of the Arab world. And then they also sometimes will literally pay to bail people out. So I had one example of a man from an area where tribes are still quite important in southern Jordan, who said that he was asked to pay the equivalent of nearly $500 to bail out a young tribesman he'd never met for murdering someone, who had been put in jail for murdering someone. And the tribal leaders literally went round every single person and said, pay up, pay up, pay up, pay up. So I guess that's one type of benefit, I suppose, that they accrue. If you get put in jail, then maybe they'll help bail you out. And young people also expect benefits in terms of help finding a job, maybe help finding a accommodation, even help finding a partner. But increasingly, and again, I think this is a lot of this is down to the economic changes that the region is undergoing. People just don't have the resources to be able to support these kind of traditions. So lots of young people we spoke to said, I went to my tribe to help me get a job, and they didn't because they couldn't. Or they say they went there and they said, please can you help find a house? And again, they said, sorry, we can't. And I think a lot of young people really dismiss them as something that's old-fashioned and something that's ultimately useless. In Saudi Arabia, there was someone from a Bedouin background who we spoke to who said that he still goes to these tribal meetings every weekend, every Friday. And he described it as a sad affair and said that they just repeat the same old poems and they do superficial things, but it's basically become meaningless in their life. And then someone in Tunisia said to me, from a rural background, that you would turn to your tribe in a situation of despair, but not in one of joy. So really, when you're at your last resort, that's when you would return to your tribe, but if things are going great, then you have no need for them. So as well as economic changes and increased mobility, I think, reducing the importance of tribes in people's lives, governments are also shaping them, and in most cases, weakening the importance and the role that tribes can play in society. So across the Middle East, the various elites in the 20th century set out to modernize their states. They wanted to build healthcare systems, they wanted to sort of electrify the countryside, they wanted to put in sanitation projects and education systems. And in the process of doing this, they displaced a large role of what tribes traditionally played. And these same modernizing elites tended to view the traditional forms of social organization, like tribes, as backwards. And so in places like Tunisia, the regime there worked systematically to break down tribal structures. In Jordan, the state has done something similar, but there's a real dissatisfaction because the state, as Jordanian said to me, the state has displaced the tribe in terms of the services that it offers, but then doesn't offer those services because it simply doesn't have the resources to be able to do so. So, and then in some other places like Saudi Arabia, the state has played more of an in-between role, where they haven't tried to deliberately destroy the role of tribes, but rather they're trying to co-opt them. And so they're trying to remove the power of tribal leaders and incorporate these social structures into their systems of rule. They're able to do this to a large degree because of their oil wealth, so they can extend the same resources and the same benefits to their people. But they've also done it, they do things like the Ministry of Interior has appointed someone, an identifier, a mu'arraf, who in each tribe, who's meant to act as an intermediary between the tribe and the state. And the government will deliberately choose people who aren't the leader of the tribe, but a rival to the leader of the tribe, to create then a struggle within the tribe to ensure that it will not get too strong. So as states have displaced tribes, they've taken on enormous amounts of responsibilities and obligations of their own, but they've done this in very different ways. And the way that the state acts in terms of conferring these resources is also quite different in the way that it used to happen with tribes. So states have, I think, failed to build the same kinds of loyalty to ideas and symbols that we have in the West. I think most British people feel a sense of pride in the royal family today, as it's seen as a real cornerstone of British heritage, even if we realize that the whole thing is kind of ridiculous. And I think probably most Americans could name various ideals that you associate with America. That might be freedom of expression, liberty, a spirit of entrepreneurship, or capitalism. But in all four countries, we asked people, what do you associate with your country? What ideals, what values do you associate with them? And of 111 interviews, not one person could name a single thing. And I think that really shows that they don't feel, I mean, I suppose one caveat, this could be the way I phrased the question, but I then did give examples of the UK and whatnot. And some people said to me, do you mean my passport? That's what links me to the state. But I think this is a real issue, is that some of these states have, because they've been able to provide for their citizens, the citizens don't necessarily feel the same degree of things that they're prepared to sacrifice in exchange for this. So, but some are trying very hard to build it. So places like the UAE, are building national monuments. They now have Martyrs' Day celebrations. They have introduced a national conscription service, which is mandatory for all young men, to really try and instill a sense of patriotism. And they do these very sort of in-your-face shows of national pride. And in Saudi Arabia as well, I think things are really changing and they're trying. So Mohammed bin Salman, as perhaps many of you know, MBS, or he's also known as MBS, has tried to remove rival centers of power, but has also really tried to build a sense of nationalism. But everyone we spoke to said it was completely failing. So we spoke to people and said, oh, did you take sort of national, there's something called Tarbiyah al-Wataniya, so national education in schools. And they all laughed and they said it was ridiculous. And I said, why was it so ridiculous? And they said, well, because it was a contradiction. So they might have a class before that's a religious class, a class on Islam, where they say nationalism is terrible, you are a Muslim first and foremost, and then you literally go to your next class and you have someone talking about Saudi Arabia and attempting to build a sense of pride in Saudi nationalism. But they also said, in the case of Saudi Arabia, how do you define Saudi nationalism? You can't say you're a Muslim, because there are a lot of Muslims who aren't Saudi. You can't say that it's Sunni, because there's a sizable Shia population in eastern Saudi Arabia. So what do you say it is? And they said what seems to be the case is that they're trying to define it as anti-Iran, which strikes me as a very dangerous thing to be trying to push. But beyond compliance, the states often make very few demands of their people. And this might be why there's very little sense of national identity. And I think what this means, though, is when it comes down to it, what would people sacrifice for their nation? And I think that's a big question which remains unanswered. So why should we care about all of this? We've seen that young people in particular are leading social change in the Middle East as elsewhere. People increasingly conceive of their interests based and their ambitions in personal terms rather than in communal terms. And I think social structures are fraying. We're undoubtedly witnessing a very significant rise in individualism across the Arab world. I think one of the reasons we should care about this is, who do people turn to when they're in need? We've heard that families are less able to support each other because of their economic situations. Tribes are weaker. Maybe they've been deliberately dismantled by the state, or they've been co-opted. So then, when someone is really in need, the people who they would traditionally turn to are no longer there. And I think there's a very real question about what happens if there are other groups who are offering these same kinds of things, these same kinds of resources, the same kind of sense of belonging. Maybe groups like that might become more attractive. I also think it's important because nations, we should care about what states are trying to do here. And as I've tried to say, states really are trying to shape a lot of these relationships. But we don't, the states over there don't have the same kind of relationships that we might have with our governments here. There isn't the same social contract where we expect services and action from the government in exchange for paying taxes. We can hold leaders to account, and we can demand change. But what does it mean if you don't have that same relationship and people don't feel that same sense of belonging to a state, when the state needs to ask sacrifices of its people, as is happening in Saudi Arabia and the UAE when they're asking their people to go and fight in Yemen? What does that mean? What does it mean to cut back on the services it offers? Will people just accept that, or will they find new ways to challenge the states? I think there's also a question about increasing levels of authoritarianism in places like Saudi Arabia. People's willingness to confront authorities in defense of relatives, kinsmen, and friends has very much decreased in recent years, and a sense of fear in Saudi Arabia was really palpable. There was one man who I spoke to who said that no one would even tweet on his behalf if he was arrested, and he said he's sure that his father would do nothing to try and help him because of the fear. Incredibly sadly, 3 months after we were there, this man was arrested with a wave of arrests against women's rights activists, and I looked and I didn't see anyone tweeting in his support, and as far as I know, he's still in jail today. So how will publics address their grievances or try to rally for change? If they weren't allowed a voice in the decision-making process, they have lost a lot of the channels to demand change that they previously had. So in conclusion, I'd say the United States is probably in a much better situation to deal with the rise of individualism that's happening around the world than the Arab world. And I think that's because individualism is at the heart of the American myth. It's at the heart of the American sort of cultural identity. But it's not for many people in the Middle East. And I think Arab societies are increasingly getting unmoored from the foundational sense of community and are now being set adrift. And for those of us like me who watch the region and try and predict what might happen and try and understand some of these changes will be hugely consequential, but the direction they're going to take is very far from clear.
Will, thank you. I'm just going to point out, there are microphones that are right down here, so anybody that have questions, please come down either side, and we'll be here to further discuss this with you. So thank you very much again. So questions? Okay, I'll get this started. Why is this important to us, though, in Montana? I thought my voice carried. Why is this important to us here in Montana to consider what you've just shared with us in terms of our citizen responsibility as well as where this connection may be as far as the Middle East is for Montana?
So I think probably there are various ways. I think in part, I do think there's looking at changes like this in a very, very broad way and trying to identify how support networks are changing and are being eroded, I think is important because of the consequences of that. So part of it, which I alluded to, is that these are the kinds of situations that certain violent groups seek to capitalize on. Now, I don't want to stress that too much because proportionally a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of people would turn to these groups. But I think there's also a sense that a lot of people have lost so much hope that they're able to improve their lives and that there's the support to enable them to reach their ambitions, that they will try anything they can to leave the region. And in places like Tunisia, people said to us, the sign of success for us is if you can leave Tunisia. And so that, I think, is consequential because the places they leave, I mean, are certainly U.S. allies, but they may even sort of come here, so I think there's an impact, and I think it's important for us to understand the context that they're coming from, and that this may have been the only option or the best option for them in an incredibly difficult situation. But I also think, maybe on a broader level, it is worth thinking about the rise of individualism and how that's impacting our lives, and seeing that a lot of the things that or a lot of the frustrations that people might feel. My parents complain about how much time I spend on my phone. My parents complain that I don't get in touch with them as much as I should. A lot of these things are not unique to here. They're playing out all across the world, but the impact of them might be even more extreme elsewhere.
There's a question, please. Oh, we have somebody at the microphone. So if you do have a question, please go to the microphone, or if you're up front here, I will bring it to you.
Okay, I've got lots of questions.
Fire away.
So one of them is that I think that the concept of this sort of individualistic mentality is deeply connected in Western society to the Enlightenment philosophers, and that's how this sort of development of individualism has presented itself in American ideology. And do you think that there's sort of a bypassing of that idea within the Arab world because of technology and because of this sort of increase of communication and increase of accessibility to a different kind of world, and if that shift is sort of part of that conflict?
So certainly. So I think in some ways the changes are happening so rapidly in the Middle East that it's happening that it really feels like it's out of control. So there's someone who I spoke to who's actually a former classmate of mine in Jordan who said to me, I think he must be about 24 or something, and he said he considers himself part of, or his experience as opposed to the experience of his younger sister who's 20 is completely different. And so he was saying these aren't even generational change, there are micro-generations. Things are happening so quickly, and he said she's able to do things that he could never have done. She has more mobility or whatever. So I think that's one way of just expressing just how fast some of these changes are happening. And whenever there's a big change, I think it takes a long time for the dust to settle, and I think a lot of people are really grappling with some of these shifts.
And then, do you think that trying to create nationalism in artificially created states is just kind of difficult? So, do you think that could potentially happen, or that it's much like if you see a decrease in this tribal identity, where is this identity going to come from if it's sort of an artificially imposed structure?
So I'd say the most successful countries that are trying to create these new identities are places like the UAE, where they're simultaneously trying to build on tribal heritage and say that tribal heritage is an important part of the UAE, but also saying tribal heritage is sort of like a building block to this much greater thing. And I think when you think of the UAE, I mean, it's made up of 7 emirates, and even, 40 years ago, it would have been much more unusual for people to work outside of their own emirate. It took a long time to travel there and whatever. And now there's the transportation link, so people are able to travel far more. And so increasingly, I don't know if you look at the imagery, increasingly the UAE is removing references to all 7 leaders of the emirates and referring to the president of the UAE as a whole. And I think they're being more successful in this, partly because their campaigns are so severe in a way. So every young man is now having to do national service and go through this process where they're really drilled, as this sense of patriotism and nationalism is drilled into them. And then they do these sort of ridiculous shows of national pride. And I think eventually it might catch on, and they're also trying very hard to say what values it is to be Emirati. So there are places, there's a monument called Wahat al-Karama, like the oasis of dignity or something, and there are these huge discs. There are 7 discs which are saying the 7 main ideals or ideal values of the Emirates. So they're saying it's compassion, it's chivalry, it's honor, it's all of these things. And so they're really trying to drill that into people. But when we were there, we went to visit this monument thinking, oh, how exciting to see people sort of soaking up all of this nationalist rhetoric. There's literally no one there. So they're trying very hard, but it's going to be a very difficult process. And the example I gave, I think the UAE is probably the most successful of any, but I think that hints at some of the problems that some of these other countries are going to have going forward.
And then last, fairly specific question, you said that there's been a shift in Jordanian housing policy from these larger compounds to smaller compounds. And is that imposed by the government, or is that more sort of a demand from the populace?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I misspoke. That was Saudi Arabia. There.
Oh. I might have missed.
No, okay. Well, it's happening much more in the Gulf. So it's something where in Saudi Arabia, these hundreds of members of the same family would live together. One sort of crazy anecdote I guess I heard was someone said that their uncle decided that he was going to move across. Sorry, when I say uncle, this is a man probably in his 70s maybe, and he said that his uncle had decided to move to another side of the town that they lived in, and the entire family, 120 members of the family, got up and moved with him. And that kind of thing just couldn't happen anymore because there wouldn't be the housing to support that. And the government, I think, is purposefully providing smaller units in cities. It's still free for now, and it's still the government still provides free water, free electricity, but it's slowly starting to wean the population off these kind of benefits. So last year, or I think in 2017, Saudi Arabia introduced VAT for the first time, but it's like 5%. So it's still a tiny amount, but they're trying to instill this idea of taxation into the population to try and change the mentality from, rather than you will be given all of these benefits, to you get these benefits in exchange for something back for the state. And it's tiny steps, but that's what they're trying to do, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In the places where other groups are supplanting the states and the tribes as far as being able to provide the services and the goods to the people, are a lot of these groups terrorist groups? What sorts of groups are these?
So I would say basically there aren't groups that are supplanting these things. So on the whole, there aren't new social structures to be able to provide these kinds of things. In some situations, there are extremist groups that are able to do that. Places like ISIS provided resources to the people living there, who people living in eastern Syria and in Iraq never had those kinds of things before. So one of the reasons why I guess they did relatively well was they had things like garbage collection and stuff like that, which provided services that just didn't exist before because the levels of governance were so weak. But I don't want to stress that point too much, because for the vast majority of people in the Middle East, they don't turn to those kind of groups. And instead, I think they try and create there are other chosen networks which they're trying to create to change this. So one person said to me, LinkedIn is my new tribe. In Jordan, and she said that she has her professional contacts on LinkedIn, and she's able to go to them to ask them for help when she needs, and she would provide help for them in the same way. And so in some ways that has replaced the kinds of things that a tribe would have done before.
Is there a concept of non-profit?
In the Middle East? Certainly, yeah, certainly, yeah. There's a lot of civil society. A lot of the times the states make it very difficult for them to operate, but there's civil society in all of the countries, I think.
In a lot of the countries that you did interviews, there are displaced refugees, Libyans in Tunisia, Syrians in Jordan. Did you speak to them, and if not, do you expect you would see an extra level of disconnection, isolation, individualism, or do these processes of like being a refugee, does that strengthen perhaps your bond with your family?
So yeah, we did. We didn't directly, I suppose within the interviews that we used sort of formally for this project, we didn't use that data, but we did speak to refugees sometimes by accident because we didn't realize they were a refugee before we started talking to them. And I think it's really interesting. When the economic situation is so dire, I think it can lead to completely opposite reactions. One is that people will band together even more because their only way of surviving is to band together. And I think in general, nuclear families still do that. So even though all of these things that I've been talking about are very, very difficult, I think most people said when push comes to shove, their family will still be there for them. But at the same time, other people said when sort of economic situations get harder, someone in Jordan said, oh, well, there are whole areas of the city which I'll avoid going to because I know that if I bump into someone, I might have to offer them a coffee and then maybe offer them food, and so they will literally avoid them because they can't even afford to do that. So I think it has a weakening impact on the broader networks. But then in terms of refugee communities, I guess, in Jordan at least, I know of especially young Syrian men who fled on their own from Syria, mainly because they were trying to flee conscription. And they then live in shared houses, and they will certainly support each other. So I guess that's another kind of a chosen network. But they really do band together and share resources. So I don't think there's one way necessarily, but I think the very general pattern we're seeing is that those connections that are slightly outside of the nuclear family are getting weaker, but that probably the family would still be there.
Can you, so you alluded to the idea that part of what creates national identity is having a stake in government, for one, and a sense of accountability by elected officials. So you've talked about all these other ways that different states in their world have kind of tried to avoid granting that in any sense, and have instead kind of destroyed these family institutions in a way in various methods. But have you seen an awareness by these states of that maybe creating a sense of national identity, and them taking any smaller steps towards creating some sort of representation in government or accountability?
Sorry, so just so I've understood correctly.
Sure.
So are the states sort of destroying tribal structures or whatever deliberately to lead to a...
Not deliberately to lead, but since they have started to do that in some instances, whether intentional or not, are you starting to see them have an awareness of that fact, and because of that start to take steps towards creating some form of representation, even if it can't lead to a large level of that at the moment?
No one that we spoke to referred to that as happening. But then, I suppose, having said that, these little things like introducing taxation does sort of lead to that. But the problem is then when the channels, so in somewhere in like Saudi Arabia, where the religious establishment has had their wings clipped, the business community was rounded up and put in the Ritz-Carlton in prison, where women's rights activists have been put in prison as well, and tribes have been sort of co-opted. They've systematically destroyed all of these, and they are certainly trying very, very hard to create a sense of national identity. I just think it's going to take a long time to take root, and they don't seem to be seeking to have sort of greater representation as the way of going about that.
Is this push towards nationalism, is it creating conflict between the state and religion?
Oh, yes. Really interesting question. So I didn't talk about religion at all, and perhaps that was an omission, because clearly religious networks are another important kind of network that people are in. I think, yes, in places like Saudi Arabia, certainly the religious community, I mean, as I suppose the example I mentioned of someone going to an Islam class followed by a national identity or national education class, the people who were teaching the Islam class are probably not agreeing with the content of the national education class at all. So it's certainly ruffling feathers, I think. I do think Saudi Arabia is an extreme case where the religious, clearly it's sort of very, very conservative, and the religious authorities have a much outsized role compared to other countries in the region. But then at the same time, they're having their wings clipped, as I said. So the religious police in Saudi Arabia no longer have the power to arrest people outside of the justice system. So now they're only allowed to do it if there's a sort of real policeman next to them. They still drive around and shout at people, as I heard, but they can't really do a whole lot more than that. And so that's really decreasing the power, I think, of some of these religious authorities and institutions.
You just answered my first question. And my second question is, a lot of these factors that you talked about sort of leading to the disintegration of these traditional things have, at least in my mind, sort of like a lot of them sort of come from like Western values, Western ideas, Western technology. Is that perception shared by a lot of the people there, or is it something that are there people who see it as something that's more like organic or coming from some other place?
I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone across the region, even though a big caveat I should have said for all of this is that obviously there's variation in these countries, and I'm sorry, I'm making generalizations based on these interviews I did, but there are certainly changes in how people view some of these things, and there are some people who said family is incredibly important and will always be important, and just as one caveat, but they were in the minority. I'm not sure that people think of this as necessarily Western values or ideas. I think people think of it as modernization, and they may link that with the West, but I don't think on the whole it's, especially the younger generations, I don't think are viewing this as a sort of corruption. I think they view this as just the future. It's, I think, the older generations which might say, oh, they've lost their sense of community, which was so important to us. They're sort of forgetting what's really important in life. And especially in Tunisia, actually, I think the older generation of people that we interviewed were incredibly critical of young people for being selfish, for being for not having sort of perseverance. They said things like, since the revolution, they said, oh, young people litter now, they don't stop at traffic lights just because they don't have to, because it's not a dictatorship anymore. And there was this really strong sense of generational divide, and they were very critical about these new values. So I'd say it's probably generational how people view it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a kind of long question here. Would you say, because you talked about how countries have tried to rebuild national identity, and the Arabs have had nationalist waves before, with Nasser in Egypt and right now in Syria and in Iraq. Would you say that this is just the modern regimes struggling to grasp their interactions with the West that have put down nationalist movements? Would you say that the West has a role in combating nationalism by supporting Islam, and now the Islamic regimes are struggling to build a national identity because those have already been crushed?
So, yeah. Oh, wow. That's yeah. Okay. So I guess that in particular the countries that I was referring to in terms of really struggling to create this national identity are, of the four that I went to, was Tunisia, where I think what it means to be a Tunisian is changing very, very quickly because of the revolution. Mm-hmm. Saudi Arabia, where I think since the oil boom, the state was able to offer so much for its people so quickly, and people then got so used to that it's now trying to create this nationalism to combat what they know is coming, which is lower oil prices and reduced revenues, and the UAE, which I guess is suffering from the same kind of thing. In terms of sort of I guess it would be really interesting to look at some of the places that you mentioned, like Egypt, and look at kind of what's going on with nationalism in Egypt. I suppose my sense is that there is a huge push to this sense of authoritarian nationalism today. So, and that's being kind of permitted still by the West in a way, in that it's not being pushed back against. So Sisi in Egypt is enacting very authoritarian measures. I mean, even little things like the Ramadan Musalsalat, the series that come on. This year they're going to be halving the number, the Egyptian government is halving the number of them that are going to be shown, and they're taking control of they're putting a limit on the budget so that really only state-owned ones can do well, and the private ones are really being... So they're doing all of these measures across all forms of life to control people's lives and limit sense of freedom of expression, I guess, and are then trying to create this very, very carefully curated sense of nationalism that is in very defined lines. And I'm not sure, I think it's probably the inaction of the West that is probably allowing this to happen rather than as a legacy of what happened before. But that was a very good question, and I'm sorry that probably was a very bad answer to a good question.
No, it's okay. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for outstanding presentation. So I wanted to understand it. First of all, I appreciate you reiterating the issue that we should not overgeneralize about these. And I would humbly share that the whole concept of tribe is absent, in fact, in certain Middle Eastern countries outside the Arab world. For example, Israel, for example, Turkey, for example, Iran. Tribe has more or less either existed at one point, has disappeared, or never existed. But in the case of the Arab world, I want to understand this. So over 100 years after the partition and the creation of these artificial countries. We all know how they were created in a process. We are still dealing with a situation that the state cannot actually create a new identity. That's what I'm hearing in your presentation. So the Saudi state basically has ended up demanding total, unquestionable loyalty to a prince, or to a dynasty. The same thing goes in some ways with some other societies in the region. What is this leave us with? That is, where are these societies going? They're not becoming nations. They were artificial to begin with, so they cannot create a sense of nationhood. Iraq, who is an Iraqi? It's always wondered. It's a Kurd in the north, it's a Shia in the south, it's the Sunni in the middle. Who is a Syrian? The Kurd or the Alawite or the Sunni and so on and so forth. So they're all grappling with this issue of national identity. And what you have shown brilliantly is that all these magnificent statues and jet fighters releasing color in the air, they're not working either. Can they ever become nations? And in the absence of not or failing to become nations, aren't we just left with dynastic national security states, most of them relying for their security on the United States?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think I guess this is what I was sort of trying to get across in all of this is, I don't know where we go from this. I think it's been a failure. I think it's not been important for them, for many of these states, especially the very oil-rich states. It's not been necessary for them to work on building these identities and these values and these symbols, because they didn't need to, because the people were always going to be loyal to them, because they, somewhere like Saudi Arabia employs 80% of the population in the state sector. So when you have a situation like that, I suppose it wasn't a priority for them. And then, maybe as the economic situation gets worse, maybe people will realize that they really have no one else to turn to but the nation, and will start to accept that it's not going to provide for them in the way that they might want, but it still is something that's holding them together. But I think more likely is that people will demand change and will come to say, okay, so you're not giving me what I used to have or what I want. I don't feel any sense of real affinity necessarily with the state, so this whole system needs to change. And maybe that's part of what we saw with the Arab Spring. Maybe that was a part of it. And I think because of the fear that has been instilled in so many people, I think that's what's stopping a lot of people from making these demands. But I don't know how long that fear can keep going for. And so, yes, then I suppose we are just left with security states, which ultimately the United States, and not just the United States, but other countries as well, are propping up artificially. And I'd say that's a very sad state of affairs.
So we have another question. Before that, gentleman, please step up to the mic there. Well, if I missed this, my apologies, but can you give a sense of the enormity of what this youth population actually represents throughout the Arab and the Middle East countries in terms of what percentage of the population?
Yeah, so 2/3 of the population in Arab countries are under 30. So when we talk about a youth bulge, that's a huge amount of people. I think the population of the Arab world is 440 million, or something like that. So we're talking about, my maths isn't good enough for this, but a lot of millions of young people, hundreds of millions of young people, who are the ones who are driving these changes, I think, and who are the ones who are suffering from these changes as well. So it's a huge part of the Arab world.
So you've talked about how government has taken the place of many of the economic benefits that used to come with family and tribal membership. I'm wondering if anything has taken the place of the emotional benefits. Are people spending more time alone, or have they found other ways to socialize?
Yeah. Another very, very good question. So I think in a lot of these countries, there are new networks. Well, friendship groups, I think, are spending a lot of, people are spending a lot of time with their friends. So whether that's online or actually in person, most of the people that we spoke to who were sort of under 20 said that they spent far more time with their friends than with their family, or their nuclear family. The problem with that, as this one sort of Jordanian said, who I mentioned, was they might provide this emotional sort of support, but they probably won't provide any kind of material support if people are in need, whereas families, I think, would. But certainly, I think there are new technologies allowing for new people to interact. This isn't exactly related to your question, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's funny. I spoke to one, I mentioned this on the first radio show I did here in Montana. I spoke to a young man in Saudi Arabia who, when he sat down, he put 3 phones out in front of him on the table. Now, I'm used to sometimes people have 2, maybe, but 3 seemed excessive to me. So I said to him, I was like, what on earth, why do you have 3 cell phones? And he said, oh, well, one is for my family, one is for my friends, and one is for my girlfriends. And girlfriends, plural. And I sort of like, what on earth are you talking about? And he was like, I compartmentalize my life so much that he literally has different devices for the different levels of interactions. And so then I said to him, I was like, oh, so are things, I was then talking about sort of social changes in Saudi Arabia, and I was like, oh, are you interested in a relationship with any of these girls? And he looked at me as if I was completely insane, and he was like, why on earth would I marry any of these women? They talk to men on the phone. So there's it's quite hypocritical. But I guess gets at one part of some of these contradictions that are going on, or the fact that some of these changes aren't happening smoothly. It's there are still some of these feelings that he has very strongly about who you should and shouldn't talk to and whatnot, and who others should and shouldn't talk to, I suppose, but doesn't necessarily practice what he preaches.
Hi. So I was wondering if you found in your research, any anomalies in Tunisia. In Israel, I know there's a large Tunisian Jewish population, and I know that Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE are predominantly Arab Sunni Muslim, but with Tunisia having a large Berber and historically Jewish population, does that have an effect on identity and relationships there?
Definitely. And I'd say in general, these changes that I've been talking about are much more pronounced in urban than rural areas, really across all of these 4 countries. But I found that particularly acute in Tunisia, where we went out to the west of the country and were speaking to some people from a Berber heritage, and they certainly, I think, felt firstly a lot lower sense of mobility, and I think because of that, then the sense of local community is much stronger, because you know that you're going to be kind of stuck with all these people. To put it in a very negative light, I suppose in a positive way you'd say, because you spend so much time with these people, you care for them much more, you spend more time together and whatnot. And so then the sense of local community seemed much, much stronger there. But then there was one young woman, or I guess she was, I don't know, in her 30s, and she's from a Berber background, and she came to Tunis, to the capital, and was determined to be free of all of these social obligations and responsibilities that she had. But then her parents moved after her, and then moved into her apartment, so then she was then living with them. And then she said that really things changed quite a lot. Her mother got sick, and she really felt terrible. She said that she had sort of tried to move away from them, and then she said, I kind of realized what was important in life, and I sort of really, I think her friends don't understand why she would still be living with her parents at that age, and she's And she said that's kind of very, very important to her. So certainly there are definitely anomalies to these. There are some, I don't know, I suppose in Saudi Arabia there was one thing that came up is that quite often there'll be one incredibly conservative member of a family who tries to veto all of the liberal plans of all the others. So there was one guy I was talking to who said that he really wanted his daughter to go and study in the States or in Europe. And in Saudi Arabia, you have to have your male guardian's permission to do that, and he was very ready to give it. And his wife was like, absolutely not. No way is she traveling there. And so it was her who was really put her foot down, and even though the father might have been more liberal and more permissive. So again, I'd say this isn't happening evenly. There are absolutely anomalies along the way.
Okay, so that's loud. So to avoid this will be a bit rambling, but I'm curious. It seems like a lot of this sort of crackdown is the wrong word, but sort of circumventing or outflanking of tribes was done in an attempt to centralize power, whether that was in response to some sort of color revolution fear or something like that. It seems now that that same tribal sort of, not dual power, but sort of side structure might seem beneficial to governments. Have we seen any governments that have sort of tried to rebuild that or to reconstitute that tribal power in a way that would not be like nakedly authoritarian as sort of a means to sort of replace what they have sort of initially sort of moved around?
Destroyed, yeah. Very interesting.
And would that be beneficial, do you think, or is that feasible?
So I think it could be beneficial if it was matched with, if these structures had the resources to be able to provide the benefits to their members that the members expect from them. So I think places like Saudi Arabia that have sort of co-opted them, they do still pass on resources down to the tribes, and they don't want to destroy them completely because they realize that it's that's probably too great of a sort of social dislocation. So they would much prefer to have people in tribes who they know that they can sort of control better. I'm not sure if anyone else has, if any other countries have sort of really changed track, and I think it's probably because they can't. So partly because tribes don't have the same sort of role in people's lives, so it would probably then feel unnatural to young people to suddenly have things coming from a tribe. But also probably these government places like Jordan. I mean, Jordan is suffering. Jordan's economy is going through very, very difficult times, and the government, I think, probably just doesn't have the ability, even if it wanted to revitalize these kinds of networks. So I've not seen that happen, and it's probably because they can't, but maybe it would be useful.
Will, do you have any final comments that you want to share with the audience? And thanking everybody who has come here. If you have any additional questions, I know Will will probably stay around afterwards, and please come up and engage with him. So any final comments, thoughts you want to share?
So a few, I suppose. So firstly, I'd say if anyone does want to get in touch, or I don't know, if anyone's ever in DC, please come and say hi. I've got a few cards, but otherwise I can give out an email, and would be delighted to be in touch with anyone if that was interesting or useful. Also, if you asked a question which I answered really badly and you're very unsatisfied, then let me know and I'll do some research and come back with a better answer for you. Two then final things. So firstly, I want to once again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Geer. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone. It's been amazing to be here and a privilege to speak to you. And finally, I suppose I don't want to be too pessimistic about all of this. I've been very, very pessimistic, I realize, but I also want to really pass on that there is, I think, an enormous amount of hope in a lot of these situations as well. I think young people are overcoming hurdles which I couldn't imagine overcoming to pursue their ambitions and to keep going and to try and make of their lives what they want to. And so I would say that in all of this pessimism in terms of economies getting worse and social fabric sort of fraying, I think there's a lot of hope in this young population to be entrepreneurial and to be resilient and to kind of overcome these challenges. So I suppose that's a slightly nicer note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming here this evening. Safe drive home. And if you do have a question, I know we'll stick around for a few minutes. So thank you, folks.